While the rest of the world struggles with the corona crisis now in its second or even third wave, the country where it all began appears to be well on its way to recovery. China is reporting daily case numbers in the low 2 digits, and its pandemic management appears to be paying off economically. China is the only industrialized economy that has seen growth in 2020. But how reliable are the statistics? China and the coronavirus, from superspreader to economic winner, that's our topic. And welcome to the Point. We have a great roster of guests to answer that question. It's a pleasure to introduce Clifford Coonan. He was a foreign correspondent for 15 years in Beijing, and he says China's success in dealing with the coronavirus shouldn't distract from its emergence as a challenging strategic rival. And I'm very pleased to welcome Moritz Rudolf. He's an analyst and expert on China at the German think tank SWP, and he says China has been partially successful in gaining international discourse power, yet by revealing an ugly side, Beijing has failed to profit more significantly from the COVID-19 crisis. And we're very pleased to have with us Qian Sun. She is a freelance journalist from China, and she says, compared with the financial crisis 2008, China's COVID-19 recovery plan is greener, more domestic, and digital-oriented. So let me start out by asking you, Rudolf, China has reported economic growth of nearly 5% in the third quarter of this year. That's a rate almost equal to what it was doing before the pandemic hit. But how reliable are those statistics, both on the infection rate and also on the economy?
Well, big numbers in China are always a difficult topic by itself. But when we speak about a general trend of recovery, especially compared to other major economies in the world, we can say that China has been more successful than other countries in actually going back on track and with its economic development. So I think we can see, well, even if you analyze the data is robust, saying that, of course, there's this increase. If you dig a little bit deeper, then the question, of course, is where is this growth happening? There are different problems between the rural population and the urban population. Is the gap actually widening? And it seems to be the case. Is the gap widening between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises? The answer is yes, there as well.
When we'll come back to the stability and sustainability of that growth picture a little bit later. But let me ask you this, Qian Sun. How do the Chinese people see it? Do they have the feeling that China is well and truly out of the woods, beyond the pandemic, and ready to sail full steam ahead?
I think the short answer is definitely yes, because right now, if you compare the private life of people's daily activities in China and outside of China, other than cannot go abroad for vacations, the daily activity in China seems to be pretty much the same as before the pandemic happens. And people definitely have a different view now, what's going inside and what's going outside.
Clifford Coonan, you say in your opening statement that China's success in dealing with corona shouldn't, quote unquote, distract from its emergence as a challenging strategic rival. Doesn't China's success, in fact, prove the comparative effectiveness of its model, at least economically?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what price you're prepared to pay for these situations. We see at the moment a systemic battle emerging in a way between US and China, which some are describing as a Cold War. I think the success of the coronavirus in China, but also in countries like Taiwan, New Zealand, Finland, and even Germany has been pretty good at dealing with it. You know, shows that this very tough approach is very effective. But you do have to ask yourself at what cost that comes and whether you're prepared to. There's a lot of things that just can't happen in a democracy that can happen in China. So this is where people have to weigh up what approach they want to take.
Qian, sometimes you hear people in the West, especially businessmen and women, saying that the Chinese are simply more effective at getting things done. Would you say there's some truth to that, and do the Chinese themselves see it that way?
I think it's a very interesting question and very relevant. I think to a certain extent, there's a very, I think it's starting from even the education, right? So if you compare what a high school student, like their schedule daily, and compare with what a German student or an American student, you sort of, I mean, I don't believe there's a difference by race or by different nationalities. I don't think that exists. But it built into the education system, and then people have been trained to perform differently and have a different expectations of how much work and how effective that specific person should be. So I think there is a difference in that.
So let us take a look at how China got things done when it came to pandemic management. We have a report that takes a closer look at the measures that brought the virus under control in Wuhan, the city where it first emerged.
December 2019, Chinese authorities recorded the first infections of an unknown lung disease in the city of Wuhan. The outbreak probably occurred at a wet market. Coronavirus spread at breakneck speed throughout the country and infected more and more people. Many died. China built emergency hospitals in record time, shut down entire cities, and closing off residential districts. Hundreds of thousands of people were locked down in their homes for weeks. Schools and stores remained closed. China in lockdown. Those who are allowed to move around again were closely monitored by the state, with thermal imaging cameras and clinical thermometers. The government also recorded the movement patterns of all citizens. Apps provide information on individuals' health and location. No access without screening. Wuhan in the fall of 2020. The city has its everyday life back without masks, without social distancing. It's as if the pandemic had never existed. Are dictatorships better at fighting disease?
Let me put that question straight away to Moritz Rudolf, coupled with the question relating back to your opening statement, because it talked about China's tactics as having an ugly side. But if you see those pictures of normal life in Wuhan, if you see these numbers on recovery, couldn't you argue that the social and political benefits outweigh the costs?
Well, what China wants to do is it wants to show to the world that it is a responsible international power. Of course, we have seen it as an efficient system to control the spread of the virus. But that doesn't make China a responsible international power, what they want to be. So the question has been China at the beginning of the crisis, they were sending out masks to Italy, to Spain, to other countries that are really hard hit from the crisis. But at the same point of time, just a couple of months later, Chinese bullfrog diplomacy was really aggressive directly against other European countries. So China actually had an opportunity to show this side, because especially with the United States not filling in this role, China actually had the chance of doing that. But they haven't been doing so in practice, because some of the masks and the equipment that was sent was of low quality. And in addition, they showed a really, really strong and aggressive and pushy side to cash in the favor just a couple of weeks after they were delivering that. So the mask diplomacy has failed. The question is whether the vaccination diplomacy will be successful.
But domestically speaking, if you look at the measures that were taken, which you criticize as having an ugly side, measures of surveillance, measures to some degree of social repression, don't you think that they did deliver real benefits for the people in Wuhan?
Well, we have to say that those measures that they were put in place, of course, they were at the price of individual liberty. So, of course, for the Chinese side, there is no interest in upholding the individual liberty of individuals. And the process that was already in place before was only accelerated through the corona crisis. So if you say that the most important issue in life is state stability, then of course it is really efficient, and then the answer would be yes. But if there are other areas which you would consider of important and human interaction and living in a country, then the question and the answer would be no.
So let me come to Qian Sun to ask how people in China see it. It's sometimes said that the government's handling of the pandemic, as we saw it there in that report, has actually boosted trust in the government and the state. Would you say that's right?
I would say it's right, because I think in the end people look at what's the result, and the result is really right in front of our eyes that China's life is resumed almost back to normal. And I think in China, this mentality is kind of very strong that the benefits of the many outweigh the benefits of the few. And I think also the government used this opportunity to tell a really good story, right? Like they use their, almost seems like a crisis. And also actually in the Chinese words, crisis means wei ji. That's actually a crisis hidden behind an opportunity. And that's what the government has been done.
So, in fact, some people who tried to report on the uglier side of the way that the government handled the crisis, including in Wuhan at the height of the pandemic, faced very severe repressions. I think a couple have, in fact, not been heard from in quite some time. Has that had no influence on public opinion?
I think we also have to look at how public opinion is formed in China, right? So we don't really have this public sphere that's very sophisticated here, for example, in Europe or in other countries. And how the media plays a different role in China is also very different. They are more advocacy for what the government wants the people to hear instead of forming this public sphere for opening a discussion. And so they are broadcasting what the opinions that want to be heard instead of having a critical voices. So I think that has a different layer, or add a different layer to the whole story.
Clifford Coonan, if you wish, speak to that point as well. But I'd also like to know, coming back to this idea of whether dictatorships are better at getting things done, why it is that China manages to erect enormous medical facilities in record time, manages to roll out a mass testing program for millions of people in record time and apparently smoothly as well, where Western countries struggle.
Well, over the years, I've covered many major stories in China, and one was the earthquake in Sichuan in 2008, and there I witnessed how there was this incredible operation to fix the situation, and dictatorships can mobilize in this sort of way. But I mean, if you look at Taiwan, which is a democracy, for example, also ethnically Chinese largely, it also had a very small number of cases, and it was very successful in controlling it. So, or if you look at New Zealand, that's also been very successful. So I don't think it's dictatorships per se. Certainly, they can do things. They can introduce these mass projects very quickly, but I think, again, if it comes at the cost of personal liberty, the whistleblowers, as you mentioned, who were taken away, and dictatorships also create a narrative, and this narrative is what people there's no alternative to this narrative within China, because dissent is very quickly, online dissent in WeChat and stuff is very quickly done away with. So it's those are the options, basically.
Moritz Rudolf, do you think that some of the Chinese tactics that we saw there in that report, the measures of surveillance and so on, can and will be applied in Western countries as well as they seek to bring the virus under control? I'm thinking, for example, of the corona apps and so on. Do you have concern that China could become a kind of a model in ways that you see as problematic?
Well, I think the dividing line will always be the protection of private data. I think there's a different approach to that in Europe than there is there to China. I think more interesting will be whether third countries, like in Europe, I don't see it happening at all, but maybe in countries that are ideologically maybe divided between orienting themselves towards looking at the West or looking East. The corona crisis definitely will show and convince many of them that the Chinese approach is more efficient, it is maybe less costly. So those countries are the ones that will be more interesting to look at. And I think the Chinese side has been quite efficient in approaching exactly those third countries.
Qian Sun, our report showed normal daily life returning in Wuhan. How confident are people there, and how confident are you personally, looking at the situation from abroad, that the situation really is stable and sustainable, that the pandemic won't come roaring back, for example, when the cold season starts?
I think from a public health perspective, yes. I think they controlled all the borders, and they're not there are really people even coming in, landing in China without any trace. And also, there's a really strict quarantine policies right now in China. So whoever comes from abroad would have to enter a 14-day quarantine, not at home, in a hotel separately. So I think from public health perspective, yes. But if we look at from economic perspective, for example, right now the boost and recovery is quite largely rely on domestic activities. But China is a really important part of the entire supply chain and economic chain. So how long China can stay like this, or how fast economic can boost, really depends on the international and global environment as well. So I think that's the question people are asking right now.
And we're coming to that topic in just a moment, but I want to have one brief look at China's corona diplomacy and the question of a vaccine, because China is now saying that it's likely to have a workable vaccine by the end of the year and that it plans to share that vaccine with its closest and neediest allies. So do you think, Clifford Coonan, that that actually will be the next big triumph for Beijing, or is this perhaps just a dose of propaganda?
I think it's a dose of propaganda. I think what we've seen so far has been this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which has been extremely aggressive, characterizing equipment that was being sent as aid when in fact it was being paid for, the criticism of the response by the French government, for example. There's been a lot of senior diplomats in Europe, Chinese diplomats in Europe, who've been behaving very badly. And a recent survey by the Pew Research body showed that a majority of Western companies have a worse opinion of China than they did before the coronavirus. I think if the vaccine comes out, it could be... there's a lot of questions about the vaccine, whether they've gone through stage 3 testing, if it can happen so quickly, how all of this is happening. And so often with China, you come up against a brick wall where the questions stop. You know, like, how did the virus come about? We don't know, because nobody can investigate. This is a big issue. And, you know, so all of these questions are coming together. So I think while the vaccine, it may have a short-term effect if it is effective, but I think longer-term, these questions still remain.
Qian, very quickly, if you would, are you more optimistic about the vaccine than what we just heard?
I think it's a bit more nuanced discussion than it appears to be so. Because right now, the front runners, if we look at the vaccine, Chinese company is part of it, but there are also joint ventures. For example, one of these mRNA vaccines is actually jointly developed by a German company and has investment from US and from Chinese company. And this is somehow on a private company level. So I think so on top of a state-promoted and vaccine development that serves the purpose of propaganda, there are actually real collaborations behind that as well.
So let us now come back to the question of where things go economically from here. And the fact is the global economic balance was shifting eastward even before the pandemic. So does China's corona success translate into an even more dominant position going forward?
More and more, higher and higher, faster and faster. New houses and factories are springing up like mushrooms. That creates jobs and growth. After coronavirus lockdowns and plummeting exports, the world's second largest economy is now steaming ahead. With the help of an economic stimulus package, massive investments are being made in both infrastructure and industry. But China is not shying away from building brand new coal power plants, which, in addition to cement and steel, is another climate killer. In September, the Chinese head of state promised the UN General Assembly that the country would be CO2 neutral by the year 2060. Officially, China is sticking to this goal, but the focus is now on unconditional growth. That's one of the reasons why China will probably be the world's only major economy to experience growth this year. But how high is the price for this upturn?
And let me pass that question straight on to Moritz Rudolf. How high is the price? Is this growth strategy as good as it looks?
Well, I think we have to see in the next quarter whether it will prove to be a sustainable growth model from the Chinese side. I think at the moment some of the bigger strategic questions there remain unsolved. which is that many companies in Europe and also in the United States are second-guessing to what extent the close economic relations with China are in their long-term best interests. So I think this is a question that could either intensify in the future than not. And right now, there are some German companies that are profiting from increasing exports to China. Of course, this is the case. The question is how sustainable this will be, because the structural problems that China is facing and has been facing for quite some time, they are not being solved with the current stimulus packages. But of course, we have to say that from the Chinese side, the most important goal there is to become a high-tech leader and using, as was mentioned before, this crisis as an economic opportunity to become a world champion, to provide the world with solutions in this way. But we have to see whether this Chinese state-run process of having this close connection between companies and the state will actually lead to innovation, which is helpful to solving the questions emerging after the corona crisis.
So, Qian Sun, in your opening statement, you said that China's COVID recovery plan is green and digitally oriented. But 26 new coal-fired power plants in planning and support for the auto industry would hardly qualify as being very green. So is China ultimately prioritizing rapid growth over sustainability?
I think we have to look at, so the keyword is also plan. So their plan is to be greener and to be more digital-oriented. And if you compare with the stimulus package released right after the financial crisis in 2008, back then that 4 trillion yuan was really carbon intensive and based on building highways and bullet trains and really infrastructures. And right now the plan is to build the so-called new infrastructure plans, highly based on AI, 5G, and also digital infrastructures. But in a short term, like if you look at the economic growth of the third quarter of this year, it's still quite highly, let's say, carbon intensive. And this think tank, Angora Energy Wende, they had a really sort of a very thorough track called the Corona Tracker, and they tracked how Chinese sort of economic boost correlate with the carbon usage for this year. And at the beginning of the pandemic is a drop down, but right now it's going up again.
Clifford, beyond that, aren't there some other hidden weaknesses in China's growth model as well? I'm thinking of very high debt or the fact that China is very, very dependent on exports. Could that ultimately trip China up?
Well, I think people have been calling the collapse of the Chinese growth model for a long time. So I'm always a little bit wary about jumping in on this. But certainly there are high levels of debt, but it's also a very large economy, and it's shown itself to be very flexible in dealing with changing conditions. So I think that Chinese growth will continue for some time. But the export factor is as has been mentioned as well, I think it is going to come into play again at some point, because domestic demand isn't going to be enough to sustain. There's other issues facing the Chinese economy, for example, is that it's aging quite fast. And most developed economies, or developing economies, the idea is to get rich before you get old, and China may get old before it gets rich on a broad base level. So this is a big factor as well.
Moritz, a couple of you have mentioned the fact that despite China's efforts to turn the corona crisis to its public relations advantage abroad, in fact, wariness of China has grown recently. Now, the fact is that Germany has declared a reset on China policy and says it wants to push back much harder, for example, on human rights issues, on the detentions in Xinjiang of the Uyghurs and so on. But isn't Germany arguably even more dependent now on China for growth, for exports, for being able to sustain its export model than before?
Well, China, well, as we mentioned before, China will be, in some areas, it will be a growth engine. The general direction of pivoting also away from China and looking for other markets in the ASEAN region, I think this is a strategic decision that has already been made before the corona crisis was started. So I think actually this, the necessity to actually continue this move in some areas away from China is actually increasing, despite, of course, in some areas, the necessity to cooperate with China as a global player in other areas are, of course, remaining the same. But I think strategically there is a move towards less dependency from China and looking for other emerging markets in the region, which are there, of course.
Let me come back very briefly to our title for one last question. And the title, of course, asked whether China emerges from the corona crisis as an economic winner. The fact is, China, while the rest of the world languishes, will account for over 30% of the world's economic growth this year and possibly into the near future as well. So, Qian, what do you think? Will China use that new power, its status as winner, to help pull other countries out of their own downturn?
I'm slightly suspicious of that because I think if we look at it, China has to because it depends on global economy. But as released from the new strategy that China would like to focus on is domestic stimulations. So I think I'm slightly suspicious of that.
And Clifford, quick answer to the same question.
I think it will emerge as an economic winner, but I think I know it's a terrible thing to say, but I think we will have to wait and see how it eventually plays out. We have to look and see what happens in the US, particularly in coming weeks, which we haven't really discussed yet. So yes, a winner, but a lot of external factors.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us for this very interesting discussion. And thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.